Welcome to the Magnificast, the podcast about Christianity and leftist politics. I'm your co-host, Dean.
And it's New Year, same me, Matt Bernico.
That's right. It's New Year, same him, Matt Bernico. It's New Year, different me, old me. I don't know what I'm saying anymore. It's 2025.
It's just like we're always becoming, you know? We're never
That's
really
right.
who we're going to be at the end, if you think about it.
Yeah, and I'm thinking about it, and I think that you're right. Man, I thought for sure that would be a really natural pivot into what we're talking about, and I bet it's there,
Nope.
but I'm not going to discover it. Instead, this is the energy I'm bringing to 2025. We're just going to power our way through it and talk about what we want to talk about on this episode. And Matt and I have been, for the last couple of weeks, closing out the year and starting the new year by returning to this book that we're working on degrowth in St. Francis. And man, writing a book, it's really fun. It is also very hard. And we are working on this chapter on the GDP and growth in general. And we thought maybe we would just take this opportunity on this podcast to do it live, to talk through the GDP together, to try to work out some of these problems together, and maybe test a few theses. And we've got a lot of good listeners, so maybe you'll all have some good ways to help us figure out what we're doing here. But we thought it would be interesting to kind of start this year with a conversation on GDP, not only because we're working on the book, but also because it's something that kind of comes up in the news cycle whenever there's a bit of a change of government or people are reflecting on an outgoing administration like Biden's and Trump's coming in. But also, for example, here in Canada, there's a lot of GDP talk happening. And I know across the pond with the Labour government, there's a lot of GDP talk as well. And it just seemed like the right time to be talking about these three big important letters that everybody loves to talk about the GDP.
You down with GDP? No, not at all. Not me at all. I hate these letters. They're so stupid. Yeah, that all sounds good. GDP is always like a really prescient topic. People love to talk about the growth of the market as a stand-in for the health of a society. That's usually how people get to caring about the GDP and like whether or not it's going up or not. If the GDP is going up quarter by quarter, then the economy is strong, it's growing. That's what people say. And if the GDP is shrinking for 2 quarters, for example, then at least by some judgments, the economy is faltering and it might even be considered a recession. So that's usually where the conversation about the economy begins and ends, right? Like when the line goes up, yay, it's good, we're all cheering. When the line goes down, boo, no, tomato, tomato, it's bad. And what we're here on this podcast to tell you is that sometimes those things are true and sometimes those things are not true. But overall, the GDP, the gross domestic product, is a really bad way to like say whether or not a society is prosperous, thriving, or happy. It's a bad way, in fact, and we're here to tell you all about why that is.
Yeah, that's right. We talked about this a little bit in the past when we've done some other episodes on degrowth. In general, it's the kind of thing that degrowth people like to talk about. That's why we're talking about it in our book on degrowth as well. And I think that it kind of merits its own discussion. But the reason beyond just like some people on the left like to talk about it is that it is also the metric by which countries basically judge their success. And it's the kind of rubric that after the Bretton Woods conference, if you remember back to when we talked about the IMF and the World Bank and all that boring stuff, at that stage, the kind of Western political powers had agreed that the GDP would be the agreed upon rubric by which people would kind of understand national economies, compare them, make choices about them. And it's a pretty significant thing, not only because, you know, it's maybe like a common economic language that governments use to talk to each other, but it is also a really flawed economic language and one that hides a lot of different things that make up the economy. And it's also the kind of thing where like it creates these really weird distances between how people talk about the economy when they're in a position of political power and how people actually experience the economy. So I thought maybe we could start the conversation with a bit of a kind of quick media example of how this works. And then maybe we can start parsing out the GDP and what it is and why it's not very good or incomplete.
Yeah.
Is a better way of talking about it.
Sounds great. Tell us all about the media and what they have to say about the GDP.
All right. The media, they love this number. Journalists love it because journalists are not generally economists. So they like to have a round number that they can talk about that everybody respects and loves. And the downside of that is journalists also don't take the time to figure out what the story behind the GDP is. And so instead, they kind of tell you the story of the GDP. And it leads to some really bizarre political conclusions. And here is one of them. So over the course of the 2024 election, people were talking about the health of the economy. There was a lot of talk about inflation and figures and all kinds of stuff going on. And in October, going into the election in November, the White House talked about the growth of the GDP by, they said, 12.6% over Biden's term, which is a pretty big number, a big increase for the GDP. And the White House is pointing to this as kind of proof that Biden is a great economic captain. You know, he's like taking the U.S. from the challenges of the pandemic into a thriving economic situation. The GDP of the U.S. was a lot more stable than a lot of other countries emerging from the pandemic. And so that's the story they tell. Because the GDP is going up, Bidenomics must be great. And if you don't want to believe the White House, you could read, for example, an article in the New Republic that was published earlier in December by Bryce Covert. She says this: by nearly every metric, Bidenomics was a roaring success. And she says the economy at the end of Biden's term is remarkably strong. GDP, she quotes, has risen 12.6% over Biden's tenure, far outpacing both predictions made even before COVID became a household name and growth in other advanced countries. There's other metrics in that article too, but you can see kind of how GDP is like shoring up the argument here a little bit. By nearly every metric, it's a roaring success.
It's a roaring success, says the New Republic. That they agree with the White House 1 week. And then, interestingly enough, a week and a half later, after that piece came out, the New Republic ran a different piece by a different reporter, reporting that homelessness in the U.S. increased by over 18% in 2024. So the final full year of Biden's presidency, it went up. So between 2020 and 2024, once again, the years that Joseph Gordon Biden was president, the cost of rent and groceries also went up by double digits. So I guess like that's the interesting story, or the interesting tension in the GDP, is that journalists say that, you know, the line goes up and we're all really happy about it. How great. But the line going up does not mean a good situation for everybody. It's still, the line going up means that still 18% of people, the highest rate ever, can still be homeless, or that the price of rent and groceries can still be going up by double digits, even though the GDP line is going up. So I think that's actually a really stark and important distinction for, well, I mean, a lot of people have made a lot about that like rift with regard to how the election went, and maybe someday we'll get to a full sort of analysis of the Bidenomics of it all, but today is not that day. I just want to point out maybe in this episode exactly like why these two things can coexist when the line is going up and it should be good, but it is actually bad for so many people. I think it's a really important thing to figure out if you want to, you know, be a really good critic of capitalism and a really good critic of...
Yeah, and it's the kind of thing too that is not just a disconnect that you see in the US. For example, I mentioned in Canada, we're getting ready for an election year. So there's a lot of talk about the economy. And there was an article published in the CBC just this fall that was also relying on the GDP to kind of tell a story about our own economy going into an election. And it is so wild how uncritical journalists can be, or how kind of unthinking they might be. First of all, this article interviews like some literal libertarians and like heads of banks, and not the kind of thing you want to see in like a national broadcaster, but whatever, that's what they chose to do. And anyway, in it, they say this: a rising GDP per capita means there's more wealth to go around, including for governments, which can collect more tax revenue from a growing economy without necessarily raising taxes. Which there's a lot more to say in this article, but that sentence alone kind of tells you the ideology at work here. GDP going up does not mean there's more wealth to go around. And I don't know, like, why at the CBC the editors felt like this was something to print, but, you know, Canada is not a social society where the kind of economic growth that the country achieves is rationally distributed or planned, and the government just kind of like absorbs the surplus and does smart things with it. We live in a capitalist society, and it's the kind of story that you see all over the place. The GDP goes up. That means naturally it's this kind of like weird trickle down economics argument, like as long as that number is growing up, everything's going to get like sorted out or leveled out across the economic plane. But that's not true in the US. It's not true in Canada and anywhere else. The GDP does not indicate that kind of shared improvement of an economic situation.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and that's really what so much of this comes down to, is whether or not you believe that the GDP is going to be somehow like, will it really trickle down to all these other people down at the bottom? The answer is no, it doesn't. And thinking so is absurd, like legitimately absurd. Well, okay, maybe to prove the point about how absurd the whole thing is, Dean, let's talk about the way that the GDP is calculated. There are 4 primary factors about how it's calculated, and each one of them are about how like value is added to the economy, right? So all of these different procedures, practices, etc., how they add value to the economy, and they are extremely limited. Once we read through them, you'll be like, wow, there should be more on that list. Anyways, Dean, we can go back and forth through these maybe. So the very first one is the value of goods and services purchased by citizens. So your Funko Pops, your Spotify, your Netflix, your food, your groceries, your rent, all of that is going into GDP. And that actually, this first one is a big part of like how people make the argument that an increasing GDP means like satisfaction, which I think is actually a really flawed idea. I buy lots of stuff, and I gotta tell you, I'm not satisfied at all. So anyways, it's just like it is a weird assumption. And you can tell like that is such an economist brain thing to think, like, yes, people are buying things and they must want them. And it's like, no, I don't want any of this stuff. I don't know. It's so stupid, but that is like the very first stop on the GDP tour of how we get to the big number.
That's right. All right. Cruising along to the next stop on the GDP tour, an extremely disgusting, ugly tour, is how much money businesses reinvest within the country. So your business is absorbing a lot of capital. They have to do stuff with that capital. And the amount of that capital that they put back into the country's economy, which they can do through a lot of different means, adds to the GDP. So, for example, if you have a great plastic communion cup factory, which, man, I got to find out how those things are produced. If you have a factory that produces those little plastic communion cups and you're doing great, all the Baptists, they're getting them all from you pretty reliably, you're booming, and you choose to take some of those profits and spend them on expanding that factory so you can make even more communion cups, you've contributed to the GDP as a business. So you've got, so far, the value of goods and services purchased by people, and also the money that's going back into the country by the businesses. That's stop 2 of the big GDP train.
Right. Let me say something else about stop 2 on the GDP. I feel like we're talking about Dante's Inferno, like where every stop is sort of like one more level down towards the icy cold center of hell.
Yeah, Virgil is like very sadly dragging us along with also just like a giant money bag attached, shackled to his leg.
Exactly. The number 2 here, how much money businesses reinvest in the economy, is also, that's like the trickle-down economics part of it, or at least it's one portion of the trickle-down economics part of it, because people will say, who are proponents of capitalism or who think the GDP is a great way to measure, I don't know, how good a country is doing or something, they'll take this and be like, okay, well, see, look, the money that a business reinvests in the country is actually good for the people at the bottom because it means, new jobs and that kind of stuff. But here's the thing about money that is reinvested by businesses. The whole reason that they're reinvesting that money in a business is basically to keep it from the workers. Like they're always trying to find, this is a big thing that we talked about in like the Monopoly Capital episodes we did maybe a year ago. But like a business is always going to try to widen the gap between how much it costs to produce something and how much profit they can make off something, right? That's like surplus in Marxist terms. And when companies do that, they have to find ways to like take that surplus and use it. And the trick of using that surplus is if they reinvest it all in production, that will mean that like production becomes too efficient. They become too good at capitalism. They're creating too many things, and then their profits will end up falling because they've made too much stuff and nobody wants to buy it all.
Like Funko Pop.
Like Funko Pop, exactly. Funko Pop and their big trash bin of Funko Pops. So they have to find other ways, creative ways, to take that money and quote unquote reinvest it by like giving CEO bonuses, like inventing new jobs, like marketing. when they were writing the Monopoly Capital book, it was in the 1960s, like just the precipice of Mad Men. So marketing was like a new idea that someone had just invented to like hide capital from workers, and like tied up in real estate and all kinds of other things. So reinvesting money. A business reinvesting money does not mean that like, yes, now workers will have an easier time to create products and they'll get paid more. No, it's getting like hidden away in all these secret sort of ways throughout their business. And that money is not trickling down, I got to tell you.
Right. Moving to the third step here, the third way to count or to kind of contribute to the GDP calculation is the export of goods and services outside the country. So you're still making money by sending those goods out and getting paid for them. That one's pretty straightforward. And maybe we can zoom along to the fourth one, which is maybe a little more interesting. It is the part that the government itself pays in consuming and investing in its own economy. So providing services like roads or healthcare or schools, because the government is spending more, to build more stuff or provide more services and so on. So taken together, these four things make up the gross domestic product of a country. The goods and values, or goods and services that people buy, the money that businesses reinvest, the export of goods and services, and the stuff the government is pumping back into the economy. All these things add up to the GDP. And just as like kind of a boring footnote or asterisk here, you can look at the bottom of the Magnificast page and find this little note. The GDP, usually when people talk about it, they're talking about like a fixed period of time, typically a year, and they're usually also talking about a country. But people use the GDP for all kinds of weird stuff. Like you could measure a smaller period of time, the GDP over quarters, for example. You could measure the GDP of a specific industry, I don't know, toys or church stuff. If there's a church stuff GDP study out there, I do want to see it. I've never seen it, but I got to figure out how much the GDP is kind of emerging from church products. Anyway, all that to say, usually we're talking about the national economy, and we'll talk about that for the rest of the episode, but people use it for all kinds of stuff.
When we were walking around Rome, there was one particular street that had all of these church supply stores on it, like where the priests would buy their vestments and their chalices and stuff. I imagine that's going to make up a pretty big part of Italy's GDP, right? Like it's got to be a chunk of it.
Just clergy stuff.
I think so. The bones.
the God GDP.
How much are the bones?
The bones are priceless. I think we know that.
So Italy's GDP is just through the roof because they got these bones. They can't even calculate it. The IMF is like, we stopped trying years ago. You guys got too many bones over there.
That's right. So this is the number that people use to judge economies, to say that they're doing great or they're not doing great. And on the surface, on the face of it, it kind of makes sense, right? This is a number that's trying to get a sense of a pretty gigantic and complicated field of economic activity, a whole country. As Matt was saying, everything from your Funko Pops to your cell phone to insurance companies, all the kind of stuff that's going on is getting added up in these particular ways to contribute to the GDP. There's some other kind of interesting stuff about it. One way to maybe summarize how you get to the GDP is to say that it's trying to measure the value added in an economy, which is an important thing for two reasons. One is that it's kind of capitalists admitting that value does get added throughout the production chain and in the market and so on. But as we'll talk about in a minute, they don't necessarily understand how that value is added, or maybe more accurately captured through different parts of the supply chain. The other bit is that when we talk about value added, we're not necessarily talking about like the entirety of like every single thing that somebody produces in a country that all goes to the GDP. You're talking about kind of what happens at the very end of that process, which is pretty hard to track. So for example, you don't want to like double count stuff when you're counting up the GDP. So say you're a Bible factory, the paper mill that makes the paper or whatever, and they sell it to the Bible factory, and then the Bible factory, they make the Bibles and they sell it to you as a consumer. Kind of figuring out like where to stop that chain of value adding and contribute to the GDP is a bit complex. But the idea is that usually you'd count the kind of final product sold to a consumer, the Bible, which means you wouldn't count separately the paper that's sold to the Bible company or Bible factory or whatever, because you don't want to double count the paper when you're adding up the GDP. The value of the paper should be reflected in the final kind of sale of the Bible itself. So that's kind of a boring thing, but if you're like a weird economics nerd, it's actually really fascinating. And again, it's also interesting because there's lots of value that gets contained in the idea that a final product has the kind of value added in it. Again, we'll talk about that in a minute, but there's tons of value that never really gets accounted for or kind of fed into that in the end either.
That's actually a great point. I didn't know about that piece of it, and I'm becoming an economics nerd. It's so interesting that that's the case, though, because there are all these kind of like really intrinsic types of labor and production that don't get caught up in the GDP. But it's interesting that like a big capitalist one is also left out like that. Huh.
It's like not left out as much as it's like it is reflected in the final sale of the product. So, for example,
I see.
When, let's say you're making a Bible and you buy paper from a paper supplier, that is a cost that you have to think about when you go to sell the Bible. So if you spent $5 on paper per Bible or whatever, and you sell your Bible for $10, minus whatever other expenses you had, like labor and so on, like let's say that adds up to, I don't know, these are completely fake numbers, but let's say you bought really expensive paper and it was, half the value of the Bible that you sold in the end, and then whatever you had to pay workers and so on. So all your expenses were like $7 at the end. The value added, what goes into the GDP, is that $3 of profit, essentially, that's going to contribute to the GDP. So the idea is the paper's value is already contained in the product itself by the time it gets sold to the consumer.
Okay, this is transubstantiation. What you just described is one thing becoming another thing.
Something like that. So that's how the GDP gets calculated. But as we've been alluding to and teasing this entire time, guess what? The GDP leaves a ton of stuff out. And there are lots of parts of the stories of production and commodities and markets that don't really make their way into the calculation of the GDP. And just to kind of preface this conversation, the guy who basically was responsible for kind of championing the GDP as an interesting way to measure the economy, I forget his name right now. I'm pretty sure it starts with a K. Anyway, I'm obviously not going to go look it up. He had said that we shouldn't really use the GDP as a primary means of understanding a national economy. Like he himself had kind of read the writing on the wall to be like, you're going to end up missing a bunch of stuff. This is just one way of kind of getting your head around some parts of a national economy. But nevertheless, we have chosen to do that. We've chosen to take the GDP as the number one way of evaluating these economies. So just to kind of preface that, to say it's one of these classic examples of being like, please don't overinflate this, and yet we have. And these are a bunch of reasons maybe why we shouldn't take it as the primary means of calculating value. So there's a bunch of stuff the GDP leaves out, and maybe we can just start. We have a bit of a bulleted list here, and we'll just like go through it. So maybe we can start at the top of our list, Matt, talking about domestic labor. And you have already written some great notes for our book about this, so maybe I'll just turn it over to you to start walking us through that bit of it.
Yeah, okay. So domestic labor are all of the tasks that are done within a household that are usually and are probably for sure unpaid. So when you get to school and you see that your mom has packed you a great lunch, that's domestic labor. When you get home from school and you see that your mom has made your bed and washed your sheets, that's domestic labor. When you go downstairs and you eat dinner, that's because your mom made it, and that's domestic labor. And then after dinner, you're going to eat a big bowl of ice cream, which your mom is going to give to you, which is domestic labor. And then also she's going to do the dishes, which is domestic labor. All of those things are domestic labor, and they don't factor at all into the GDP, which is actually really bonkers. Like, okay, on the one hand, what is the things that your mom do for you? I'm really laying it on thick here. You should really think about your mom a lot. Give her a call, I guess. I need to call my own mom. What are these things that my mom does have to do with the GDP? But here it is. Like, there's no such thing as going to work or going to school or being a complicit and happy subject of capitalism without your mom doing those things for you. Without your mom making sure that you can eat food and your sort of daily life is reproduced. And all of that labor has a real cost. You could calculate it out if you really wanted to. That would be, I think, a sort of sad sad state of affairs to like have your mom give you like a bill or something at the end of the day. That is possible, but none of that is sort of calculated into the value added to the economy, even though domestic labor is like the backbone of value in the economy. Like there's no economy without that type of domestic labor that gets done. It's also worth noting, you'll notice that in my examples I gave you a minute ago, they're all your mom doing them. And like maybe you live in a great progressive home like mine where sometimes the dad does the dishes and cleans up and whatever. And that's great. But by and large, throughout, most of history, domestic labor is quote unquote women's work. And that sucks. If you want to know more about domestic labor and a Marxist perspective, you can read Silvia Federici's Revolution at Point Zero, a book that has an essay in it called Wages for Housework. That's really fascinating. It's a great essay. But basically, she's writing it in the 70s, and she was saying, that domestic work is the biggest trick that capitalism has ever pulled because it's made a type of labor natural for women, which is a great point if you think about it. And anyway, she says that to fight back, the point is not to have your husband do some of this work, but it's to get them to pay you for it so that you can go on strike if you need to, which I think is a great Marxist answer to a very good Marxist observation, but maybe troubling in the grand scheme of things. I don't know. I wouldn't want my house to work that way, but whatever. That's neither here nor there. Silvia Federici, she's great. You should read her. But all of that work that your moms and dads are doing, maybe that you yourself are doing in your own home, because the people that listen to this podcast are probably not teens, it's not added into the GDP, but it is essential for the functioning of capitalism. There's no GDP without domestic labor, is what I'm here to say and stake my entire reputation on.
A brave and bold stance, for sure. Yeah, I mean, it's actually worth noting, too, that Sophie Federici, she's awesome. You should definitely read her. She has a lot to say about that. And not that it is more important that Friedrich Engels also made this point, because it's not, but he did make it. And the reason that is important is a lot of Marxists will be very annoying and tell you that the only, ultimate kind of oppression that exists in the world is class oppression. And class oppression, I agree, is unique and importantly unique. But Engels actually had a couple of interesting places where he had noted that the oppression of women in particular is a sort of earlier form of oppression than the oppression by class. And Marxist feminists have made a lot of that point in particular. So I don't know. Take that. There's a lot going on. Our world is full of bad things, wouldn't you know it? And class is only one of them. Sexism is another one. But I think that you're right, Matt, right? The GDP, it doesn't kind of take in it doesn't recognize or calculate the economic value of domestic labor, even though it's essential. And that kind of gets us on track to start thinking about one interesting reversal when we talk about the GDP, which is that it's not really measuring only value added in a kind of neutral way. It's really measuring value captured. That value gets captured in lots of different moments in the process of production. One of those moments is by not paying for domestic labor. Capitalists, they kind of accept that there are some costs they have to pay in order for their workers to survive. And to go back to Engels, he has a really awesome observation about housing, for example. I'm pretty sure it's in The Conditions of the Working Class in England, but he notes that capitalists are in a really funny bind where they don't want to pay their workers more than they have to, but they have to pay them enough so that they can afford to rent a place that is at least kind of good enough for them to not die in it so that they can come back to the factory and keep working there. That's the bleakest version of it for sure. And Engels was writing in a pretty bleak moment in England. But the point remains that capitalists are kind of in this weird bind where they have to pay something for workers to reproduce their own life so that they can keep doing work for you. Domestic labor is one of those things that capitalists just don't have to pay families to do, right? You're not getting subsidies that you can take home to your whatever the person doing domestic labor in your house happens to be so that you can pay them, right? Your business, some businesses in your paycheck, they'll like give you, I don't know, $15 extra on your paycheck for like your cell phone if you use your cell phone for work or whatever it might be. Nobody's doing that to be like, and also here's like a bit to recognize the work that you have to do to like do the dishes for your kids or whatever it could be. And all of that is value that is essentially just kind of getting sucked back up into the profit apparatus of a business, right? Whatever isn't paid to working people ends up going upwards to the bottom line. So the GDP, again, is kind of capturing all that value. It captures the value of domestic labor precisely by not having to, remunerate it or like weaken the big number of the GDP by sharing a little bit more of it with domestic workers.
Man, there's a lot to say about domestic labor, and especially we should do like a cross read between Engels and Federici and see how that comes off. That'd be really interesting, actually. Domestic labor. Let's put a pin in that one for now, and let's move right along to another one. The GDP also does not calculate the value lost through ecological destruction, which is actually a big interesting one. So, okay, say you're an oil and gas company, like, I don't know, Shell, or it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what oil and gas company you are. You're doing this, right? You're in one way or the other. You're destroying the world. The extraction of minerals, of oil, of fossil fuels, whatever, natural gas from the earth, it has always an effect of ecological destruction in one way or the other. And whatever. There's a spill, there's a leak, something happens, you have to create more infrastructure, whatever. Any of those things that might happen in the whole process could cause ecological destruction, whether it's like the direct destruction of a particular piece of land through new infrastructure or a spill, whatever. There is value lost necessarily because then after the fact, there has to be some kind of conservation and cleanup work that happens, and that is not counted in the GDP. So you have a huge business adding to the GDP through extraction, but you don't get to see the underside of what that might cost or not cost with regard to the cleanup of it all. So an interesting factor, some bits left out because the GDP is not like there's a weird chain of causality that you just like don't follow in the GDP because it fundamentally doesn't care about those kinds of things. It's obviously has like those types of biases. So anyways, the extraction of fossil fuels, of all kinds of yucky stuff from the ground, thumbs up, we'll track it. But the fallout that it might actually cost to clean up that stuff, not going to track that.
I mean, the wild thing about that example too is that let's say a company opens up a huge, disgusting mine and they're yanking out a bunch of ore near your community, and all of that ore also poisons your water supply. And it means that people are going to the hospital, and it also means that they have to like spend more money to fix that and like sort it out and everything else. The maleffects of that big mine are also contributing to the GDP. So, for example, not only is the ore that's being sold kind of contributing to the GDP, but everybody who goes to the hospital, guess what? That's great news for the GDP. That's money going up. The money that they spend cleaning or whatever, wasting on waste, all that money also goes to the GDP. The GDP is not just a measure of kind of the good products that we like or the kind of consumer things that we enjoy. There are lots of things that can cause the GDP to rise that we don't like. A natural disaster, depending on how it goes, can contribute positively to the GDP because people have to rebuild and it stimulates the economy in these weird ways. If your car gets like totaled on the highway or whatever, that's great news for the GDP because the insurance company is going to pay out some claims. You're maybe going to have to buy a new car. You might have to buy car repairs, whatever. All these kind of disasters, but especially natural disasters or naturally created catastrophes, we might say. Those things are not just hidden by the GDP. They're actually like contributors to the GDP.
So the GDP does not calculate the value lost of ecological sort of stuff. And in a similar way, the GDP doesn't calculate the value lost through all kinds of like social factors created by growth and by pollution, like poverty. Here's an example, I guess. There are all kinds of places all over St. Louis, Missouri, a big city, one that I used to live in, you might know, And especially on the north side of the city where there's predominantly people of color, black people live there. There are all kinds of spots around the city where radioactive materials have been like dumped, and all kinds of other bad stuff's been dumped as well, right? So because of redlining and all kinds of other economic factors and social factors as well, the like black people in St. Louis are concentrated in the north part of St. Louis. That's where the cheapest real estate is, and that's where all of that stuff gets dumped, right? So there are sort of these like self-reinforcing losses of value that lead to like poverty and, you know, people's negative health. That is not factored into GDP. So like there's no like subtraction. There's no category for subtracting like poverty or ecological destruction from the GDP. But, you know, all of the businesses who are dumping, you know, radioactive material around St. Louis they are going to contribute to the GDP positively. An interesting rift, right? All of these like kind of negative things where value, like real value is lost, whether it's environmental or like the limiting of people's lives and well-being. Those things are not like subtracted from our GDP, which if they were, I mean, it would look way different.
Right. I mean, the GDP, you could say, you know, it takes economic value as the only value, even though there are lots of other things that we do value or consider valuable or whatever. I mean, the term value is a very funny term, full of lots of lots of extremely bizarre postmodern rhetorical problems. But I think it's really fun actually to be like, what are the other things that we value, and how do they not factor into the value calculations we make through the GDP or otherwise? That there's really only one value that kind of makes the world go round, unfortunately.
It's true. That's true. But sometimes that value lost in both social things like poverty and in ecological destruction, and in like even the depletion of resources isn't calculated. And it is, you know, it is value in the sort of traditional capitalist GDP sense. Like if you're using up all of the oil in the ground, that would be value lost because there's like less to actually mine out.
Right.
Or pull out or whatever the actual process is. But anyways, that's not going to be subtracted from GDP, even though it is actual value ticking down. It's wild. I don't know. It's just like some things count, some things don't count. Why? I don't know. Because an economist in the 30s made it up. Who knows?
Yeah, exactly. All right, let's move to one other means of talking about value capture. I really like this example. So speaking of the word value, you know, in our global capitalist economy, we have what most people will kind of already understand as supply chains or commodity chains, which is to say, like, if you're wearing a t-shirt, your t-shirt is made of stuff, you know, cotton and I don't know what else, polyester or something. And all that has to come from somewhere. So it's grown, you know, the cotton plant is grown. And then those farmers, they sell that cotton to somebody else who they spin it into a thread. And then that thread is probably sent somewhere else to whatever, like t-shirt factory. And they make t-shirts and then they send that to the store where you buy it. That's the supply chain, right? What are all the kind of supplies and labor involved in getting a t-shirt from cotton to a store shelf? But there are also, in addition to supply chains, things called value chains, which are, as you might guess, the kind of chains along that process where value gets added to a product. And there's a lot of really cool research on it done by some monthly review type people. This guy named John Smith, he wrote a really good book just called Imperialism. There's a subtitle to it that I can't remember, but it is really great. It's kind of older now, but the points still stand, not substantially changed. More recently, there was a good book by Inten Suwandi called Value Chains that kind of updates some of that stuff. But the key thing to kind of understand is that when they're looking at how value is added as Marxist economists, they're really interested in how the kind of work that workers do, the value that they generate, gets appropriated or exploited by capitalists and kind of sucked up as a surplus. And just to kind of make this really concrete, I thought maybe we'd take an example from John Smith. In his book, he has a really cool kind of discussion of the way this works using an iPod to illustrate it. So I said the book is dated. His example comes from 2006. And in 2006, an iPod retailed for about $300 and it sold for about $144. So the profit was around 52%. And that profit in the end is divided between Apple and then the retailers and distributors that get iPods to consumers, and then finally through taxes to the government. And even though the entirety of the production of an iPod occurs outside of the United States, so nowhere in the US in 2006 did anybody make an iPod in a factory, it was all made elsewhere, that 52% of value is counted toward the US GDP. So when you open like an Apple product, I don't know, a Mac, an iPod, whatever, you've probably seen the slogan that says designed in California. It is such a hilarious thing to see because an Apple product might be designed in California for sure, but all of the people and places and pieces involved in making it occur outside of California. Nevertheless, when that iPod is finally sold, all the value added will get attributed to California. And that is like a really wild thing, in part because, first of all, it kind of misrepresents or skews all the contributions of the people actually producing that product outside the US. But it is also a huge problem because it inflates US GDP to a huge degree, such that when the US has to kind of meet other countries in places where the GDP really matters, like the IMF or the World Bank or the, other economic fora where kind of different things are decided by the size of your GDP, the US kind of comes to those tables with like a falsely gigantic GDP to throw around. Whereas all the labor that created that thing, if nobody had worked on an iPod outside the US would never have an iPod to sell. All those people are kind of kicked to the curb, and their countries don't have the kind of same GDP calculations that you'd get from the US through the iPod. And the key that John Smith wants to make is to say the GDP is an illusion that, just like many other things in capitalism, hides all the labor that goes into making commodities. And it does that also in such a way that workers basically not only get kind of shafted or ignored, but they don't get factored in as essential to the process, which that's why workers go on strike, right? To remind businesses that they are essential, that if they don't show up, the work doesn't get done and the value doesn't get produced or created. So there's this kind of imperialism involved in GDP where all that stuff that happens outside of an imperialist center on which the center, depends and requires is ultimately just kind of value getting drained into the imperialist countries.
It's a good note about how that factors in. It's, deeply frustrating at how much the world governments chase after growth. You mentioned this at the very beginning of the episode, Dean, but I'm going to say it again now. The Labour government in the UK has been so annoying to watch because they are doing all kinds of like really unpopular and annoying things, basically austerity, saying that they're doing it so that they can drive growth in the country. Interestingly enough, in the last quarter of the year, there's been zero growth, which is embarrassing for them. So they've done all this unpopular stuff for no reason, which is funny. Funny in the sort of cosmic sense, not funny in the, the hopes for your government kind of sense. But anyways, governments will chase the idea of growth and they will literally put people's well-being and livelihood at stake for that. For that magic imaginary number that really doesn't get you anywhere in the end. Mm-hmm. That it means, things are very good for your boss, for the people that work at, the top of Apple or the people that work at the top of Google or whatever. But it doesn't really, it's not really good for anybody else. I mean, not in a big way, at least. There are certain things that we could talk about too with regard to unemployment and GDP, like, higher GDP means less unemployment, but it never means zero unemployment. So that's something to think about. Something else I was thinking about around GDP, though, is that, the governments of the world are always chasing this line going up on the chart, right? We always want the line to be going up. But what's frustrating is that, like, it's so demonstrably false that the line going up means people are, like, living better lives. It's just beyond belief that, like, we let people lie to us like this, I guess, is maybe the frustrating part. Like, okay, here's a wild example. You just mentioned a minute ago, like the value is basically kind of stolen away, or the labor is hidden when it comes to the production of an iPad. But here's a kind of wild example. This is something we've talked about before on the podcast, but I'll repeat it now. So the Democratic Republic of the Congo, you might have heard of it, the DRC. It's a country. It's in Africa, and there have been several big GDP booms since. There was like one really big one in the 2010s and also in the early 2020s, and that is all from cobalt production. Cobalt is the thing that you need. It's an essential ingredient for like a lithium-ion battery. So if you have a rechargeable electronic in your house, it probably has cobalt in it. And that cobalt is probably from the DRC because the DRC produces like 70% of the world's cobalt. It's a huge number, right? It's all coming from there, basically. Maybe someplace else, but the chances are not likely. And the boom around cobalt is, I mean, the reason is clear, right? It's because of electric vehicles, it's e-bikes, it's cars, whatever. Whatever electric vehicles are out there, it's because of they exist because cobalt exists. The explosion of the GDP in the DRC, so it went up 7.8% in 2010 and 8.8% in 2020, and it's not been good for people in the DRC. This has been, I think, big news maybe not big news, but it has been news in Canada. Not so much in the US, but it's in Canada because Canada is basically a bunch of mining companies in a trench coat. But there's a lawsuit came out against companies like Apple and Google and other sort of tech companies from Congolese families who've had family members die in the mines. And the lawsuit is such a crazy thing to read about because it is, I don't know, it's extremely tragic. Like, young kids are in these mines because that's who the mining companies hire to do some of the like less skilled aspects of the job, and they die in the mines. They die so that, you know, you can have electric cars or whatever. That is not a good look for a growing GDP, right? Like the story that people want to tell you about the GDP is that when the line goes up, life gets better for everybody. But from places like the Congo, you can see that when the line goes up, the world gets better only for a handful of people at the top, not the kids that work in the mine. I don't know, man. It's bad. It sucks so much. The DRC is such a heartbreaking thing. I'm also going to stake my entire reputation on this podcast to say that kids shouldn't work in mines. The only mines they should be in are Minecraft. And that's all. Yeah, I don't know. Screw the GDP. The whole thing's stupid. just stop doing the GDP.
Another hot and bold take for 2025. Kids should not be in the mines. Coming to you straight from Matt Bernico. And I gotta say, I endorse it. I agree.
Yeah, please. You wouldn't think that it would be a big idea, but like you wouldn't have as much GDP growth if the kids weren't in the mines. So, you know,
That's right.
The GDP would go down.
That's right. I mean, the wild thing about all these kinds of examples is like the GDP, there are other bizarre features of it. We could kind of talk about more structural, strange things about how it calculates money how it calculates value, or how, like, you know, for example, if Matt and I, every time we do this podcast, you know, if we gave each other $100 every time we recorded it, we would be increasing the GDP by $100 every single time we did that. But we don't do that. So I guess we're not contributing to the GDP by doing that in the way that we could. You know, it's just like a basically absurd kind of metric. But the key is not to say that, like, okay, so I guess we just stop using the GDP and then everything will kind of be normal. I do think if we chose some other metrics, things would definitely be different, and that's true. And there have been other proposals for different metrics to judge national economies, or even to kind of like round out the picture. The UN has suggested some other models, a human development index, for example, not without its flaws, but just, you know, a different way of thinking about measuring a country's success. Lots of other stuff, but the kicker, as always on this podcast, is we could come up with all the like fancy calculations and weird acronyms that we want, but at the end of the day, the problem is that capitalism is a system that's fundamentally premised on the growth of private capital. And GDP, using it as a metric, is just kind of like one way of expressing that problem in this incredibly absurd number that, you know, the White House will cite as a great mark of success, even when people are like more homeless now than they've ever been in a long time. And I think that's the kind of key, right? Is that the magic of the GDP won't be solved by like magically not using it anymore. It would be solved by, you know, moving to a different kind of economic model altogether. And I don't know, man. I feel pretty pessimistic about that happening in the near future, but it is kind of encouraging that more and more people are kind of investigating the shortcomings of kind of the common economic language that governments use to talk to each other.
Something I was thinking about a lot as we were writing some of this out, and it hasn't quite made it into the book yet, so maybe this will be like a great way to test some of these ideas out. But I was trying to think about, like, you know the show The Good Place? You're familiar with the show? Okay. In The Good Place, spoiler alert, you can pause the podcast and skip ahead 15 seconds if you don't want to know what happened in this old TV show. Basically, the punchline is that, like, everybody in at least the global north goes to hell because they benefit from and, like, use a system that exploits other people in the world. It's like that's it, right? Because people in the global north are uniquely responsible for the suffering of people in, I don't know, places like the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Surprise. Kind of actually a big and interesting point for a TV show to make, but it is kind of true, and they gloss over it in a funny way. That is a type of calculus that I think I find myself making a lot as a Christian, because I'm always trying to figure out, like, you know, okay, I'm supposed to love my neighbor, and who's my neighbor? It's Jesus tells me it's very complicated, actually. It's not just the person that lives next door to me, unless as I'd like to believe. But, you know, your neighbor is kind of everyone out there. I guess, like, when it comes to thinking about, like, our agency in the world and the ways that we are participants in structural types of sin and we don't want to be, like, GDP makes me feel that, like, in a really explicit way. Because the country that I'm living in, even in the UK or in the US or even in Canada, right, the GDP is thriving because of the suffering of other people. And that is somehow good. I don't know. It just makes me feel like, you know, there has to be a recognition or, like, a comportment of penance or something. I don't feel like we can make sense of GDP, like, in this critical sense, without thinking about the other side of it. Like, what do we kind of do? I guess what I'm trying to say is that there is a spiritual problem inherent in the GDP, and it is, like, the ways that we thrive because other people do not. And that is a really troubling idea. Not one that I have an answer to, but, you know, St. Francis, he's always calling people to penance, and I guess that's good enough. I don't know, man. As long as you're feeling bad about it, I think you're on the right track.
Yeah, I mean, that is the whole thing that we should maybe spend more time talking about in 2025, the affect of despair when you discover that you live in an imperialist country. But I think, you know, the crazy thing about the GDP too is, like, so just because you have a rising GDP doesn't necessarily mean that you are an imperialist country. For example, like, lots of countries in the South, they'll have a huge commodity boom, and they'll have, like, a, you know, extremely insane GDP growth of, like, whatever, 30% in a year or something, because there's a ton of oil there. But the wild thing is, like, if you're on the wrong side of imperialism, a GDP spike basically means that you should, like, buckle up for being hyper exploited. Whereas if you're in the north, a GDP spike means that you are finding some way to hyper exploit somebody else. And that is also,
that's what the kids are in the mine.
Exactly. And that's the kind of hard thing that the number doesn't tell you. You know, it, like, presumes to kind of operate on a neutral field, even with all its bizarre contradictions. But the trouble is, like, by completely removing the political and kind of, you know, exploitative conditions in given countries, it gives this false impression that everybody is kind of striving to succeed in a global capitalist market. And in fact, that's not the case. When your GDP goes up on one side, you're in trouble. And when it goes up on the other side, you are causing trouble. And that's a huge problem.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Well, there you have it. First episode of the new year. Bidenomics, a roaring success, according to some in the New Republic, even though the New Republic is also reporting more homeless people than ever before in the U.S. But I think maybe it's helpful to kind of go into the next phase of, like, a pretty right trending global political situation by recognizing, you know, these kinds of metrics that liberals have used also to kind of measure their success and sell that success to other people. You know, people are not wrong to understand that when the White House says everything's going great, they actually don't experience that in their day-to-day life. And that is a lesson that, while the right kind of takes the reins, hopefully progressives could learn that, like, maybe we shouldn't just kind of rely on century-old ways of like calculating economic situations that are not very good and hoping that everybody will just take that and run with it and reward you accordingly. But maybe we should have some other values at work when we're thinking about what we want in a different society.
Thanks for listening to the Magnificast. If you like what you heard, you can support us on Patreon at patreon.com/themagnificast. If you subscribe, even at the $1 level, you can get access to our cool behind the paywall group chat on Discord. It's a great place where people are reading the Bible. They're talking about praying. Today, people are making a list of things that they could pray about. And I think that's awesome. What a cool thing to do. And somebody asked, is this enough stuff? There's never enough stuff to pray about. I gotta say, there's too much out there to pray about, really. Anyways, you can join the listener community of Magnificast if you do that, and you can add the things that you want to pray about to the big list, or read the Bible with us, or talk about video games, or whatever you want to do. We'll probably do it. I don't know. Our intro music is by Mario Armstrong. Our outro music is by Biological Spoon, and we'll see you next week.
I don't wanna get up for church in the morning, souls alive. Heaven come to earth and there won't be no church. We'll meet down by the riverside. There we'll swim with all creation. Never get tired, never bored. Don't worry, someday there'll be no dam between us and our Lord. Jackson, you keep your hoods up. Keep your hoods up and you stay up late. In Jackson, you keep your hoods up. Well, you keep your hoods up and you stay up late. Oh, don't mind a cold night, but we might mind if you leave too soon. So come on now, it's still early.